Okay, I'd like to thank Paulo for inviting me. I always love to have an opportunity to talk about my work and my colleagues' work looking at the price effects, estimating the price effects of consummated mergers. I'm not going to describe any one study in detail today. I'm going to try to provide a broad overview of the work the economists and the Bureau of Economics have done. Just quickly going through my slides, I saw we've done about 13 studies in the last decade or so, and I'm going to try and organize them around the questions the studies are designed to address. So whenever I give a talk like this to practitioners and policymakers, I like to start off by talking about the pros and cons of doing these retrospective studies. There's often skepticism on what the value of this is, although I'm guessing from most of the people in this room, maybe there's less skepticism than I experience normally in the United States. The first thing is, this is expensive. You know, at my agency, we're very busy working on mergers and other kinds of investigations. An economist who's working on a study is an economist who is not working on an antitrust investigation. This is research, it's not directly related to law enforcement, and we face skepticism in trying to devote resources to these kind of projects. The second criticism of the kind of studies I do, which are looking at how specific mergers affect markets, these are case studies, and there's a long literature, describing the value of case studies and the disadvantages of case studies. The advantage of a case study is you learn a lot about a specific market. Everybody who's worked on mergers knows industry-specific facts are really important, and so you can really figure out what happened after a merger and why. The downside is, how do you generalize those findings? And I know when I've talked with academics, they often say, yeah, your case study is really interesting, but who cares? How does that help us do anything in the future? You haven't told me anything about methodology. How can you show me how to improve decision-making in the future? So that's the downside, or the disadvantages of this approach. Why should we do these studies? Well, I have no idea how else you could evaluate government's merger policy unless you looked at what happened after the previous decisions. This is the data that we can use to determine if we've been too aggressive or not aggressive enough. Well-designed studies can often address methodological issues, and I'm going to describe specifically how a number of studies done by FTC economists have been used to change the methodology that's used in analyzing hospital mergers. And then finally, being somebody who's spent a really long time working for an agency, research projects like this are really important as a continuing education process. When economists spend all their time working on antitrust investigations, skills might get a little rusty, you're not out there on the research frontier anymore. Being able to give economists these kind of assignments can help them get back up to speed, and then there's this positive effect that when they're analyzing mergers going forward, they have a better toolkit. Okay, so real quickly, the rest of the talk, I'm just going to very briefly describe the methodology at a very high level of the question that these studies are trying to address. Then I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail about the two big areas where the FTC's done a lot of work, looking at the hospital industry and the petroleum industry. Then I'll more briefly talk about some other studies I've done with colleagues looking at retails and consumer products, and I'll just very briefly mention the one study we've done looking at divestitures. Okay, so the studies in this literature and the studies I'm talking about are not trying to measure the average price effects of mergers. We're interested in looking at the average price effect of mergers where the agency was seriously thinking about challenging or not challenging. So we're trying to measure the efficacy of law enforcement, not whether mergers are good or bad for the economy generally. Just as a little factoid, this seems consistent with the other numbers I've seen presented at the conference. A trivial fraction of mergers are investigated by the agencies. In the US, I would call a serious merger investigation one that generates a second request. Only 4% of mergers over the last decade get a second request. So we're interested in looking at a very small fraction of the mergers that are going through. We're focusing on what I call marginal cases, and over time, as we conduct a lot of studies, we can start to learn whether the government is getting it right on average. So I wouldn't change merger policy based on any one study. Anyone who does research knows you can get weird stuff in one study. You want to have different people doing them using different methodologies to start to draw some general conclusions. All right, so let me talk about the area where I think it's easiest to point to how these retrospective studies have really changed policy. I realize in talking about healthcare, the US healthcare system is different than the healthcare system everywhere else. In the US, almost all hospitals are run by private entities. Some of them are for-profit firms, some of them are not-for-profit firms. When I started working at the agency in the mid-90s, we were doing a lot of work in the hospital area. A lot of hospital mergers were taking place. This was the first wave of changes in healthcare reform in the US, and there was a lot of mergers as a result of that. Most of these cases were decided on geographic market. The way geographic markets were defined was based on Elzinga-Hogarty analysis. I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with that. The basic idea is you make a region big enough such that all commerce that's taking place is taking place within that region. So you don't have people leaving the region to get services, you don't have people flowing into the region to get services. On average, this methodology tends to generate really big geographic markets. The mergers that were looked at during this time period tend to be mergers in either rural markets or relatively small metropolitan areas. Using this geographic market methodology, the market was so big that it started including big cities. When you include the big cities, the market shares get really small and the mergers look like they don't matter very much. Now, I don't want to criticize too much this method. I mean, methods like this of defining areas of economic commerce are used a lot in statistical agencies to try and figure out what a region is. The US government uses this methodology in defining metropolitan statistical areas. For antitrust, it's got a problem, right? Because there's no price, right? You're not looking at how people substitute based on price. You're just looking at flows of consumers where they're getting services. So during my time at the FTC and DOJ lost 7 cases in a row. We closed up shop and the hospital industry was allowed to do whatever they wanted to do effectively. And so what happened? Well, not too long afterwards, insurance companies and big employers started complaining because hospitals became really expensive. So our then chairman, Chairman Muris, decided we should try and get back into the hospital business by doing some big retrospective studies. So the agency went out and subpoenaed large amounts of data from insurance companies and hospitals. Lots and lots of staff. I mean, I would guess at least 20 staff years were devoted to these projects. We put out 3 studies looking at 4 mergers. I've got a link here, and there are full references at the back of the slides. And then a special issue of the International Journal of the Economics of Business, it's kind of a mouthful, has a bunch of papers on these hospital merger retrospectives and a number of other papers related to the hospital industry. So what is the outcome of this research? Well, the first thing and the most important thing is these studies showed the old methodology didn't work. In markets that were too big to have anti-competitive effects, we saw big price increases. And when I say big, I mean on the order of 20%. You saw very large price increases after mergers. What do we do now? Well, in response to advances in academia, we use models that are based more on theory about how insurance companies and hospitals negotiate with one another to analyze these markets. And that patient flow information is used in that modeling framework, so it's much more based on how prices are actually determined. We successfully challenged 1 merger, and now the FTC's back in business with a very active merger program, and if I've got my numbers right, I believe we've challenged 4 since 2008. So that's the one place where we can really point to a big change based on what we've done. The second area where we've done a lot of studies is the gasoline industry. In the late 1990s, there were a lot of mergers that took place in US refining. After that, prices started to go up. This is going to sound quaint, but I remember the price of gasoline broke $2 a gallon. Now in the US, right before I left, gasoline's about $3.50 a gallon. And people got very agitated. In the US, consumers are very sensitive to gasoline prices. And there were a lot of concerns from all kinds of stakeholders of the agency, I guess you'd call them, wanting to know if these mergers resulted in these price increases. So since that time, we have estimated the price effects of every merger where we think we could credibly come up with some kind of counterfactual. And what we have found is no evidence of mergers causing increases, significant increases in retail prices. I feel pretty comfortable with that conclusion. I should, and I grudgingly in smaller font on this slide, cite research by other folks who find different answers. Justine Hastings and Rich Gilbert and Justin Hastings and the General Accountability Office have studies finding that some of these mergers have resulted in price increases. Without getting into detail, U.S. gasoline markets are really complicated, having to do with the way gasoline is supplied. There are many different measures of prices, particularly wholesale prices, which a number of these studies focus on, which are some of the reasons we see differences in these results. Okay, the next study I'd like to talk about is a study we just completed right around Christmas. So as I started off, I said there's a criticism of these merger retrospective studies. I've heard it a lot more, I think, from academics than from policy folks. How can we generalize the findings? My boss, as of a year and a half ago, Joe Farrell, from the moment he entered the agency, he really pushed me to think about, can we do a study where we look at a lot of mergers in an industry at the same time to try to get some ability to generalize? And Dennis Carlton, when he was over at DOJ, wrote a number of papers trying to talk about how to do a better job with horizontal merger policy. One thing he argued for was to have a better sense of the distribution of prices that come from mergers, to stop focusing just on looking at marginal mergers, but to think about mergers in unconcentrated markets as well. So with these criticisms in mind, we designed this study. So what do we do here? We went and got some price data, and we got some data describing all retail markets in the United States in the supermarket industry. We identified all of the mergers where we could get price data that took place that were significantly big. We defined big as a merger affecting at least 5% of the stores in a region. These are all the mergers that took place between 2007 and 2008. Where the merger was the only big change in market structure that took place in those markets. 8 of them were in highly concentrated markets. Under the new guidelines in the US, that's at HHI 2500. 6 were in moderate or unconcentrated markets. And what did we find? Well, the thing that I thought was interesting in kind of looking at the distribution of the price effects, we found price increases in 5 markets. 4 of them were the highly concentrated markets. We found price decreases in 5 markets, and only one of those was a highly concentrated market. So what do I take away from this study? Well, it's like interesting to learn about retailing, and it's interesting to learn about the efficacy of the FTC's enforcement program in retail. We're the agency in the US that does retailing. But I also thought, and I think this is one of the first studies that does something systematic like this to see, do the guidelines, the concentration guidelines make sense? And I think the answer is yes, they seem to make sense. The agency should use these things as a screen. It's not the case that every merger in a highly concentrated market raises price, but it indicates that's where you should look. The next series of papers I did, and these I've worked on with Orly Ashenfelter and Matt Weinberg, the idea was to find some empirical evidence about unilateral effects. When I started working at the agency in the mid-90s, that was shortly after the 92 guidelines were introduced, which really bring unilateral effects into part of what the agencies do formally. These are really intuitive models. It seems like every case I worked on during this time period was a unilateral effects case. It's a very natural way to organize your thinking about how mergers change pricing incentives. This modeling approach is used a lot as the basis for merger simulation, like in Hausman and Leonard and Zona's paper that's used a lot, or Nevo's paper. But at the time I was working on this, I thought this is a great way to organize your thinking. These models make a lot of sense, but do they work, right? Do we have any evidence that these unilateral effects are actually taking place? We know mergers change a lot of things other than pricing incentives. What's the evidence? So I met Orly working on a couple of antitrust cases, and we talked about it, and because Orly had access to a lot of research, money for research, we were able to get some data. So the first paper we did, we looked at mergers in consumer products industries. I knew a lot about them because I worked on some of them, and we wanted to see, do prices go up? And what we found, and I frankly was surprised, this research has surprised me a lot. I was skeptical that we'd find price increases, and we did. What's kind of funny is the one industry where I was absolutely convinced prices would go up, it didn't. It was a 3-to-2 merger in breakfast syrup. Go figure. The Weinberg and Hosken paper is a follow-on to the 2010 paper. What we do there is, for two of the industries where we thought we could do a good job of estimating demand, we estimate demand a bunch of different ways. I think we have 5 or 10 different variations of demand estimation, and then simulate mergers and figure out how close they are to the observed price effects. What we find is much like some of what was presented yesterday, that the merger simulation estimates are really sensitive to the model of demand that's being used. We find some estimates that are very close to actuals and a lot that aren't. And the problem is, ex ante, you don't know which demand specification is right. So my takeaway from that paper and other papers I've seen is that merger simulations are useful at providing information about how pricing incentives might change, but I just don't know how much you can rely on the specific number that comes out of them in making a decision, which is tough in the US, because my sense is courts really want you to say prices after this merger are going to increase by 3.72% or something like that, and I just don't know if we have the data to make those kinds of predictions. The 2013 paper looked at the Maytag-Whirlpool merger. That was a very controversial merger that took place. And we find price increases of two of 4 markets that have biggest increase in market share. A result out of that paper that's a little weird is the two areas that were most strongly affected were washers and dryers. And we find a price increase for dryers, but not for washers. And I think that's just empirical work, right? You get what you get, and you try and make sense of it. Okay. The last study I'm going to talk about is a divestiture study that was done by my colleagues Steve Ten and John Yun. As has been discussed earlier, divestitures are the way, I don't know the fraction off the top of my head, but a lot of mergers are solved via divestiture. After the FTC did a divestiture study in the late 90s, there was a real preference to spinning off entire business units to increase the likelihood of the success of the divested assets. But we didn't have any empirical evidence about how successful this was. And so we identified a merger that we thought would be interesting to look at. It was the J&J, Johnson & Johnson, bought Pfizer's consumer health division. It exited the consumer health division in the US. It was a multi-billion-dollar merger. They spun off 6 lines of products. And the goal of the study was to see, do prices change and does output change? And you should, if you're interested, you should read the paper. It's a really nice paper. It's very clean, remarkably honest, for a published paper. Everything's there. And what they find is that for the big, important brands, after the merger, they look like they're performing very similarly. There are some brands that experience increases in output after the merger, but that really looks like they're moving similarly to the way they were trending before the merger. There's a product that has a big decline in market share, but it looks like that's just a continuation of a trend. All right. So that's my very broad overview of these studies we've done looking at mergers. Obviously, given the amount of time I've spent on it, I think this kind of research is really important. I think it's the only way we can evaluate the efficacy of the agencies in an era of austerity that it sure looks like we're entering, at least as a government employee. We're going to have a lot more limited resources, and what I would encourage people to do, and what we're doing at the FTC, is really trying to focus on the critical industries where we have a lot of repeat business, because that's where the generalization of these studies is most likely to take place. And then I think also we should try and think about evaluating our enforcement tools. Merger simulation is an area where I think it's a great, we use merger simulation a lot, we have mergers, we should evaluate these tools using the actual mergers to try and get a better handle and maybe build better prediction tools. And in the US at least, I think divestitures are something where we should probably spend more time. Thank you.